So, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Emily Grijalva, and she's from the School Organisation and Human Resources Department, which kind of covers a lot of ground because, as we were talking previously, her background is in psychology as well as business, and she's combining both of those to take a look at leadership, and particularly about gendered issues and leadership. Very unfortunately, this is Emily's last semester at UB, so we're very fortunate to have her talk with us before she leaves, and I'm very interested in what she has to say. She was the recipient of the Faculty Research Award from the Gender Institute, and we're glad that we could have made some impact on your research. And thank you for sharing your work with us.
All right, I'm excited to be here today. Thanks so much for having me.
As a point of order, is it okay if we ask questions as we go along?
Of course, yes. Please,
Thank
if there's anything confusing or if you'd like more detail about something, feel free to interrupt me or raise your hand, whichever is more comfortable as I go along. The project I'm going to talk about today is an update of a very classic paper by Egley and Corral, which I'll describe in a moment. It's an updated meta-analysis, or an empirical summary of the gender and leadership emergence literature. Now, this project would not have been possible without my amazing, hard-working PhD student, Katie Badura. She's really the intellectual lead on this project and is very interested in gender and is probably more of a gender scholar than I am, but I'm going to do my best to represent her work here today. And in fact, the research award I won, I actually used that to fund her over the summer, one summer, while she was doing that amazingly hard work to collect all the data for this study. Since that time, it's been published in a journal called Personnel Psychology, which I know we all have different journals, but this is one of our top journals in organizational behavior. So that was exciting as well. And so it's because of this work and your funding, she actually got a job at Georgia Tech. So she's going to be starting there in the fall. So it made a very big impact on her life.
Good.
Yeah.
Can we note that for our records? Because we like to hear good things happening.
Yeah.
It helps us get more funds to support more people.
Yeah, and so it really did, and she would, I'm sure, be happy to talk about it too. In terms of the impetus for this project, the motivation behind it, it was motivated by a practical problem that we still have, and that is there are fewer women at the top of organizations, and in general, women are underrepresented in leadership roles, which you're probably familiar with. So if you look at the US, for example, women make up only 39% of managerial roles, and it gets even worse and kind of depressing if you look at top business roles. Women only make up 4.2% of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, 16% of officer level positions in the military. And I find this puzzling because if you look at, let's say, women are getting more higher education, for example, and even high school valedictorian, now 70% of valedictorians now are women. And even more directly related to leadership, there is not a gender difference in job performance between men and women, and there's not a gender difference either in leadership effectiveness. So another way of saying this is, once men and women obtain leadership roles, they're equally good at fulfilling the responsibilities associated with those roles. Which begs the question, then why are women less likely to be perceived as leaders and to emerge into leadership roles? So in terms of what we know, in the research context, scholars find very similar results. If they look at this, and a lot of times in this leader emergence literature, it's worth noting how they measure this. What they will do is in lab or classroom settings, they will compose mixed sex groups. And then they'll give them a topic to discuss for various amounts of time, and then they'll see who naturally emerges as a leader. They won't assign a leader. And oftentimes in these settings, who emerges are the men. And this is, you can see this really classic Agley and Crown 1991 study really established that there's a pretty strong gender difference in leadership emergence and this tendency for men to emerge when you don't assign a leader. And so in this way, leadership emergence refers to whether and to the degree to which individuals are perceived as leaders by others. This is important if you think about it from the real world perspective, because in terms of the organization, you can have leadership emergence in committees and in self-managed teams. And if you are more likely to emerge, if you're perceived as a leader, then you are more likely to get higher job performance ratings and also to be seen as more promotable within the organization. So these leadership emergence perceptions have long-term cumulative impacts on women's career trajectories. The research questions for this particular project, as I mentioned, there is already this seminal meta-analysis, this empirical review. So that was published in 1991. So that was over 25 years ago, and since that time, women have made some progress obtaining more leadership roles. So there's some idea that perhaps that gender difference has decreased over time, which is something we wanted to assess. We wanted to assess how much it has decreased and whether a gap remains. We also wanted to assess what's the pathway giving rise to the gender gap. The pathway means what are those mechanisms, those intervening variables that come between the gender difference and leadership emergence. And so in particular, we looked at personality traits and specific behaviors. The behavior we were interested in here was participation in group discussions, talking. So I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then finally, what kind of contextual factors either increase or decrease this gender difference? And that can be interesting in terms of figuring out ways organizations can alleviate the gap themselves. So I'll talk about that as well, more so in a moment. For this project, as scholars, we always have to have some kind of theoretical paradigm that we use to explain our research. So a lot of our hypotheses here were derived from something called social role theory. And this argues that widely shared gender stereotypes develop from the gender division of labor that characterizes a society. So people look at the jobs that men and women hold, and then they infer, okay, they're in these different types of jobs. That must mean that their inherent personality or characteristics that differ between men and women that go along with those different occupations. And so, for example, here, men historically were in breadwinner roles and higher status roles. And so the argument is that because of this, we tend to stereotype men as being more agentic. Agentic means assertive, dominant, independent. In contrast to this, women have historically held homemaker roles. And this means they're in roles, not only homemakers, but also teachers, that are caring. And this leads us to think of them as being more communal, nurturing, warm. This is relevant because, particular to the current paper, generally we think of leaders as being more agentic. So there's this match between men's stereotypical characteristics and then the prototypes or perceptions we have of a leader in general. Interesting, however, over time, because women have been obtaining more leadership roles, if you look at social role theory, that means that maybe there have been changes in our stereotypes of women. And in fact, there's some research supporting this idea. So, I think this is hopeful, right? Over time, women have been stereotyped as possessing more agentic traits, more assertive and dominant traits. And in fact, even if you ask them to self-report, over time, they're more likely to say, yes, I am assertive, I'm dominant. So it's not only perceptions, but their own actual endorsement has changed over time. Interestingly, too, this I think is fascinating. Over time, our stereotype of leaders has changed. This means over time, we've begun to include more communal content in our stereotypical assessment of leaders. So what do we think they're like? Now more so than in the past, we think of them as being not only assertive and dominant, but also caring and developmental. That's something that we're looking for in a leader, which I think is very encouraging. Because when you look at who's effective in a leadership role or what effectiveness requires, there are both task components and interpersonal components that it'd be useful to have some of this communion for those. So because of these changes over time, we came up with a hypothesis that in general we expect the gender difference to have decreased over time. In addition, we look at this theoretical model. And here I was saying, we're interested in how the mechanisms through which this gender difference unfolds to affect leadership emergence. So we look at the traits I just mentioned, the agency, communion, and this behavior of participating in group discussions. Of course, agency and communion have been factors that scholars acknowledge as being really important for quite a while in the prediction of leader emergence. But if you look at them closely, it's a little bit vague about how exactly this occurs. What we wanted to do here is untangle what's happening. Is what's really driving it that women lack agency? Is it that they have too much communion? Or is it some combination of both? But if it's both, which one's more important? And then in addition, as I mentioned, I think it's also useful because traits are our average tendency to perform certain behaviors over time. I wanted to look at this specific behavior of participating in group discussions. And this is an interesting variable too because oftentimes this is measured objectively. They will actually use a stopwatch to record how much time men and women are speaking in groups. So it's a very precise measure of talking time. And we wanted to see how that then in turn affects leadership emergence. Participation has been identified as the dominant factor predicting who will emerge in a group discussion. As you may know, based on my description already, it's well accepted that men on average are more agentic, women on average are more communal. So we didn't formally hypothesize this because it's so well accepted. However, my poor PhD student had to meta-analyze this. No one had done it before, and we found this to be a big gap in the literature for something that's so well accepted. She had to code over 500 effect sizes for just agency alone, and 500 for communal alone. So it was a huge undertaking, and the reason she had to do that is because in order to test the whole model, you have to assess every path in the model. So that was a really cool, huge project for her. What might be perhaps more interesting is to think about how agency and communion in turn affect participation, or how willing and how much someone talks in a leaderless group discussion. We thought in general, if you're agentic, you're more likely to participate, because oftentimes participation involves taking the initiative, taking charge, and just being willing to voice your opinions. So if you're assertive and dominant, that's a behavior that aligns, or that's a trait that aligns with that type of behavior. So we thought that would be a positive relationship. On the other hand, in terms of communal traits, being kind, nurturing, we were less sure how that would relate to participatory behavior. We could really come up with counter arguments on each side for this, and so I was wondering, as people who are interested in gender and gender differences, what you think without seeing our results, of course. Would you expect this relationship to be positive or negative? Anyone have?
Negative.
Negative? Yep. So why do you think negative?
Because communal traits, making sure that everybody else is getting to say something before you do, not wanting to step on somebody else's toes, this kind of behavior.
Yeah, so that was definitely. Do anyone have an alternative? No.
But I have no problems with participation, as you can see.
Yeah. Yes, there are individual differences outside of our gender. Yeah, so we, I think, went back and forth. Initially, or eventually I should say, we actually hypothesized this would be positive. And the reason was because we thought the social component here would drive people to be more involved in a group. And in fact, if you look at definitions of communion, they include oftentimes participation in groups as part of the definition. And so we thought maybe being involved, speaking up, would meet some kind of social need. But that being said, not to get ahead of myself, but our results actually support your
So I have a question then, because
Yeah.
your interpretation of this is different than I was understanding what you were saying.
Yeah.
So the group discussion is of an academic or a technical or a business structure versus in a social setting.
Right, so this is a good question. And we actually coded this as a moderator. We coded it social complexity, the degree to which a conversation or an activity involves interpersonal coordination among group members. So something that might be more complex would be jury deliberations, because you have to make, you really have to agree with one another and coordinate with one another to get a final outcome. But many times these discussions take more of a task focus, and they do vary, and so we coded that. But I think that could be part of why you don't see women speaking up as much. As I said, I kind of spoiled our results. This is in fact negative. And so it does, or it's actually very close to zero. But I think there are strong moderators involved here as well. All right. And then finally, probably not surprisingly, we think that the more you talk, the more you're likely to be viewed as a leader. And this is so well accepted that it's even been called the Babel hypothesis by leadership scholars, supporting that idea. In addition, finally, we looked at the whole model, whether these traits and behaviors serially mediate the gender leadership relationship. So I just threw a whole lot of information at you. So I wanted to summarize it here with a picture of our model. So we think agentic traits will have a positive relationship with gender, communal traits a negative relationship, and then agentic traits a positive relationship with participation. Communal traits also, we thought, were positive. Reviewers made us go back and forth with this as well. And it was one of those things where I think the more you get deeper into the literature, you can come up with all these alternative ideas about it. Finally, participation would positively be related to leadership emergence, and then we looked at the serial mediation. So moving on, in addition to this process model, we looked at some critical contingencies, or factors that might cause the gender gap to get wider or smaller. Here you can see we looked at 4 beyond publication date. We looked at study setting, and here we looked at classrooms, lab studies, and the business context. The exciting thing here is that in the original study on this, and really most of the studies on leadership emergence, they're all with students, and they tended to be in lab and classroom settings. So we added to this by bringing in the business literature and looking at self-managed teams where someone naturally emerges. And we thought that was really important because some scholars might think this is less important if you're not able to show that it has a real-world impact on differences between men and women. We looked at gender egalitarianism. This we looked at depending upon a country. So gender egalitarianism here is the extent to which a country really supports those gender differences between men and women and formalizes them into thinking men and women should have different roles. So and I'll talk about this more in a little bit. Then length of interaction was going from little interaction to a lot of interaction. So if you made a leadership emergence judgment almost immediately after meeting someone, where they're basically a stranger, as opposed to getting to know them after 20 or 30 minutes, or even, in the business context, working with them over time. So we thought here that as you get to know someone better, then that gender difference should decrease, because you're going to be basing judgments not so much on stereotypes, but on that individual's characteristics. And then finally, the social complexity of the task, which I already mentioned in terms of the interpersonal coordination that a task involves. If it involves more interpersonal coordination, we thought the gender gap would be smaller. And I'll talk about these more in a second, because I'm throwing a whole bunch of at you. I thought I could go in more depth when we have the data to look at. Then finally, I brought this all together. So we looked at our process model, and we looked at it moderated by these important contextual factors we thought might have a difference. And the idea here is we wanted to look at the generalizability of the model. We approached this more as a research question. Would there be situations when the paths in our model get smaller or larger? Before I move on to talking about methods, are there any questions? All right. For the methods, we performed a really detailed search of the literature. So if you're unfamiliar, is everyone here kind of familiar with what a meta-analysis is, or to some extent? It's an empirical review of the literature where you go out and you try to find every single study ever published on a topic, or even unpublished data. And you accumulate that all together using empirical methods that have been developed for this. So it's better than a narrative review because it allows you to do it using a statistical method. So here we looked at lots of different databases, we looked at some conference publications that were relevant in management, and we contacted scholars who were active in this area for unpublished data, as well as contacting people who had published something but might have left out some information that we needed for the meta-analysis. And at the same time, we asked them for unpublished data too. In terms of what we actually coded, there needed to be enough information available in the source to code the effect size. And we were looking at adult samples and focused on papers published in English, because that was what we were able to code. For leadership emergence, we wanted to use direct measures. As I said, these primarily were ratings, rankings, or rank ordering group members based on how much they were perceived to be the group's leader. We avoided things that were proxies for leader emergence, like if you sat at the head of the table, then automatically you would be assumed to be a leader, because we didn't think those were really pure measures. For agency and communion, similar to other meta-analyses, we looked at the two most commonly used measures, the BEM sex role inventory and the personal attributes questionnaire. And then for participation in group discussion, we only used objective measures here, which is again consistent with how this is measured in the literature as talking time.
So what is the sex role inventory or personal attributes questionnaire?
So this one is one, it's interesting because back in the day they used to think women are this way, men are this way, but it is just another way of measuring agency and communion. So they would ask things like, rate yourself on assertiveness, rate yourself on how nurturing you are. And those were meant to capture agency and communion. They called them at that time masculinity and femininity.
So they give that to everybody who was in the group?
So this would actually be separate studies on these different topics. So this would be, for example, here, agency's relationship with, let's say, gender. And that could be measured outside of the leadership emergence context. There's a lot more data actually on this, where scholars just would give it to everyone. It could be a huge student sample, it could be working adults. We kind of coded everything that was available for that relationship. It's a good question. So overall, and I think this is what's probably a little confusing, is we had to perform 9 different original meta-analyses in order to really test our theoretical model. This was a ton of work for my poor PhD student. Usually you're kind of hoping, oh, maybe someone else has performed a meta-analysis and I can just include their estimate in my correlation matrix. But alas, there was only one existing meta-analysis that we could include, and that was by Lieber and Ayers, 2007. They looked at the gender difference in participation, and so we used their estimate for our paper. This overall, for these 9 meta-analyses, resulted in us coding 1,632 separate effect sizes. So you can think of this as us creating this really large database with all of this information for each of the studies and all of the moderators or contextual factors we were interested in. We used the Hunter and Schmidt approach to analyze it, which means we sample weighted by the sample size. So bigger samples got more weight because you trust those results more. And then we corrected for some measurement errors in our criterion and predictor, and then as well as uneven sampling with respect to gender. Ta-da! We're at the data. So we found that men are more likely to merge into leadership roles still, and this is all of the data. So to explain this table to you, the K is referring to the number of samples that were included in the meta-analysis. So here you can see this is 136 different samples. The N is the sample size. So this is the number of individual participants in all of those 136 cities that we used to come up with this estimate. Really big, over 19,000. And this is the uncorrected estimate. So a d-value is a standardized mean difference between men and women. And this is the corrected one, and you can see they don't really vary very much. That would be corrected based on unreliability. So overall, this is still pretty big. But as we mentioned, we thought this would change over time, and this is all of the, across all time combined. So here we looked at how is this affected by time, and we found that it has been reducing over time. This is a significant effect. So I think this is kind of, what?
It's kind of positive.
Yeah, it's comforting to see that it's been decreasing over time. And it's decreasing by, this is unstandardized, by about 0.01 standard deviations per year. So this hypothesis was supported. But at the same time, we wanted to say, okay, that's great, but we want to point out this isn't completely fixed. There's still a gender difference in leadership emergence in the most recent 5-year period from 2012 to 2017. So you can see here, this graph goes from 1955 to 2017. So that's the huge time span we're looking at. But if you just look at the most recent 5-year period, then there's still a gender difference. Now, if we look at some of these moderator variables that we're interested in, the first one was study setting, and I like to point out here the business setting first because that was something we were particularly interested in to see if this extends to a real-world context. And indeed it does. We were only able to find 11 studies. I would have liked to include more, but as I mentioned, this is really kind of a novel new area where research is being conducted. And there were 3,000 participants. So here, the effect size, the corrected one is 0.17, so it's pretty close to the overall sample of 0.22. Then the largest effect size here was in the lab. And I think you could understand why, and I'll show in a moment what I think is going on. Surprisingly though, the classroom actually had the smallest effect size, and it did not differ from 0. So in a classroom context, men and women are equally likely to emerge as leaders. Yeah.
So we see the effect size changing. Can you give us an idea of what this effect size means in actual terms? So
Yeah.
What is a 1.7 versus a 4.3?
Yes, so this has always been something I struggle with. And so one of the things I like to say is, think of I like to give you an example of something we think there's this big gender difference in. So aggression and gender differences. Right? We tend to think that's huge. Men tend to be much more aggressive than women. And I don't remember the specific number off the top of my head. I'd have to look at my paper. But it's around like 0.25, right? And so we think, oh wow, this is huge. But then if you look at it, the one for the gender difference in the lab is much larger. It's almost twice as big as this effect that we think is pretty dominant between men and women. And then the business setting effect size is, somewhat similar to this aggression effect size. All right, that's a good question as well. In terms of the length of the interaction, this is what I think might be relating to the lab study and the classroom study distinction. It turns out that the longer you know someone, the less likely you are to rely on stereotypes, hopefully, on average. When you immediately meet someone, then that's when you're most likely to think of them as being like a typical woman or a typical man. But you can see this steadily increasing to more than one interaction is when it's the smallest. What this means, I think, is problematic is during, let's say, job interview contexts, right, where you only get to meet someone once. I think if you get to know someone for a longer period of time, multiple interviews, longer interviews, you'd be less likely to fall prey to gender biases. Yeah.
So a 15-minute pitch, you're at 0.83.
Yeah, yep.
So that's the absolute worst thing you can do for a female CEO, and you wonder why there's so many
Right.
female CEOs when you're living in the 15-minute pitch world.
Yeah, yeah. So you would hope that they rely on something like an assessment center, where you have
15-minute pitch.
Yeah, so
That's
it's definitely
horrendous. If aggression is 0.25, and
no, this is really a startling and disturbing number
yes,
here.
that is.
And I think it goes it does say, I think for everyone, because I sometimes realize, even though I'm a researcher on this topic, that I have gender stereotypes too, just because they're so common in our society. Being aware that you really need to spend more time getting to know someone, and don't rely on immediate judgments is important. I also research narcissism, and narcissists make a great first impression in the first 15 minutes. So another reason not to rely too heavily on first impressions. Social complexity, again, this was supported as well. And things that are low, in social complexity, this means there's less interpersonal coordination involved. We found a much larger gender gap between men and women. So if you're doing some kind of activity that plays to women's strengths, then they're going to be more likely to be perceived as a leader, perhaps because they're more comfortable speaking up in that kind of environment. Now finally, this was a little disturbing as well as a meta-analyst. We found that in terms of the distinction between published and unpublished work, you find a much larger gender difference in published studies. This is something, to some extent, you would expect because we have something called the file drawer effect, where journals like to publish statistically significant results. And so you generally find larger effect sizes, larger d-values or correlations in published work. But this at the same time was weird to me because most of these studies were not specifically interested in gender. They were interested in something else, and they included gender in a correlation table as a control variable. So what we did is we did some additional publication bias analyses, in particular the Duvall-Entreaties Truman-Fill approach, which allows you to correct for this publication bias. And we found that even though, yes, the effect size got smaller, it was still significant after you corrected for that. So I know this is kind of like probably jargon to you guys, but I like to mention it because it is something to be aware of when you look at other people's studies and whether it's published or unpublished, that kind of thing. Now, in terms of additional moderators, one you might be interested in is the gender egalitarian culture. This is the extent to which a culture uses biological sex to determine a person's societal role. So countries that are more gender egalitarian tend to have fewer distinctions between men and women. They're found in similar occupations, more similar occupations. Here you would expect in higher gender egalitarian cultures for there to be a smaller gender gap. This was not statistically significant for us. But I want to point out, I think this is simply because there wasn't enough data to provide us variance in the different cultures and the different countries represented. We are only able to find data in 9 different countries. So you can see that would really cause this restriction that might make it not statistically significant. All right. Then again, best practices, if you're looking at these kinds of studies, you put everything together, all your different moderators, because maybe something is actually being driven by, and a lot of this is being driven by interaction time, you know, and what happens there. We find relatively similar results. It's worth pointing out here, what happens to social complexity, though, is that it's no longer statistically significant. So that effect is probably being explained by some of these other variables that we examine, such as the study setting or the length of interaction time. All right. In terms of the path analysis, like I was saying, I wanted to give you an idea what this looks like. So here you can see each of these is a separate meta-analysis. So we had to really create our own correlation table, and each cell in it is a meta-analysis. Whereas usually a correlation table like this would all come from a single sample. So this is how you test this kind of thing. And we ran path analyses by entering this meta-analytic correlation matrix into Lizroll 9.2. Here you have lots of different sample sizes, so in order to not be biased, we use the harmonic mean sample size, which was 2,149. And then finally, for my PhD students visiting, I teach research methods, so we calculated our confidence intervals for the indirect effects using Monte Carlo simulations. All right, jargon, jargon, jargon. Here are the results. As expected, men are more agentic, women are more communal. No surprises there. Here, you can see agency is a strong predictor of participating, speaking up in group discussions. There is this weak communion participation relationship. It's negative, but almost near zero. I think the reason it's significant is because we have so much data going into this, over 2,000 people. So there's a lot of power to test this. And then our last hypothesis here was that the participation leadership emergence was again positive. In terms of testing the indirect effects, the overall indirect effect was 0.15. All of the indirect effects were significant, meaning that indeed, as we hypothesize, these variables are acting as the mechanisms through which gender leads to leader emergence. But perhaps what's most interesting is to look at these direct effects. So how does agency by itself affect leadership emergence? That's also positive, probably as we would expect. But here, like you were saying, this is where, we're also observing this negative relationship between being kind, nurturing, and being perceived as a leader or stereotyped as a leader. And again, this is quite troubling to me because this means there's a cognitive bias. We know that to be a good leader, you need interpersonal skills, social skills, in addition to task skills. And this means that we are choosing people potentially based predominantly on if they're assertive and dominant, which leads us to choose people who might not be able to fulfill the full range of leadership requirements. So we're picking perhaps the wrong person to fill that role. And more likely than not, that wrong person might be a man instead of a woman because of how these gender differences break down. And looking at this publication date as a moderator, this is kind of a cool thing we did that a lot of meta-analyses don't do. But what we did, and what was also cool about this project, I should say, is we had a conversation with Alice Egley, the really well-known leadership scholar. So she provided us with feedback on this paper. We had an hour-long conversation with her about how to improve the paper. And so she actually provided us feedback that we needed to break it down, the model down, in terms of these moderators. Because when you throw everything in, perhaps that's not fully representing all the complexity that's occurring. And so what we did here is we took this, again, my poor PhD student. So if you look at this, matrix, we calculated two of these. One for older studies and one for newer studies. And then we compared them. All right, so what did we find? I'm only going to show you the ones that significantly differed between older and newer studies. The older studies here are on the top. The newer studies are on the bottom. Now here's something you would expect. In the newer studies, the gender gap, or the gender difference, sorry, not gender. Gender is not involved. Sorry. The communion, the negative effect of communion on leadership emergence decreased. This means that communion became less detrimental to people over time. We would expect this because we saw communion is being included more frequently in our stereotypes of leaders in recent years. So that was pretty, understandable. This is where we were surprised. In more recent years, communal traits have a more negative impact on participation. Any suggestions here for why this? Any ideas, Glenna? I'll let you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I have an idea. Well, I think it's not because of publication date, but because publication date is correlated with other features of the study. And so, for example, I'll show you the length of interaction time. We found the same finding here, where this is shorter interaction time on the top, longer interaction time on the bottom. Longer interaction time, communion tends to have less of a negative effect on leadership emergence. Similarly, agency has less of a positive effect on leader emergence. Again, though, we're finding this communion participation relationship is also increasing over time. And the explanation we provided in the paper is that perhaps when women know the other people in the group more, they try to take a more facilitative role. To maintain harmony, like you were saying, they're more likely to step back and let other people speak to try and make the group function more effectively. But this is only, perhaps one explanation. And we also think that this is interaction time. More recent studies have a longer interaction time, which might be explaining the publication date findings. So it's the summary of the results. There's still a gender difference in leadership emergence, but it's decreased over time. It's predominantly, how I said we wanted to untangle whether it's women's lack of agency, their abundance of communion, or both that is potentially explaining this gap between men and women in leadership emergence. What we found is it's predominantly perhaps the lack of agency that is explaining this, as well as the effect of agency on participation. But at that same time, communal traits also had a negative direct effect on leadership emergence. So you're kind of getting this double whammy when women have lower agency and higher communion, as we expected. But it is interesting to see, the relative strengths of these two relationships, because we also found that the effect of agency was stronger than that of communion, and we did a statistical test of that. In terms of the findings, how these generalize to the business context, this was the first study, as I mentioned, to show that for sure, that even though you're getting longer interaction times in the business context, you're still finding a gender gap in leader emergence. And we thought perhaps this is because the workplace is a very competitive, real-world context where there are promotions on the line, pay, and because of that, you're still finding these gender stereotypes to have an important influence. In terms of our practical implications, we thought carefully about these. We didn't want to just suggest, okay, women, you should, the obvious solution is just go out and participate more in groups. That is perhaps one potential takeaway in some situations for some women, but there's also a lot of research, unfortunately, on something called backlash, where women who engage in agentic or stereotypically masculine behaviors are not perceived the same as men, and they can be punished for those kinds of behaviors. So we want to be very careful in the types of takeaway, and so we said, these gender differences probably exist for a reason, because women and men are treated differently when they speak up, and you might be perceived as pushy, or especially if you're disagreeing with other group members. One thing I think is useful is to train people about their biases in terms of selecting leaders. To tell them, you know, you have this cognitive bias, people in general have this cognitive bias, to prefer assertive, dominant characteristics when they are looking for a leader. But that might lead you to select the wrong person who doesn't have these other characteristics that are also important for being effective in that role. So also consider communal traits at the same time. And that could be for both men and women. We also wanted to provide some training programs at overcoming biases regarding speaking up at work. How women, you know, one reason perhaps you speak up less when you have longer interaction time is if you're ignored. So you're taught that that behavior isn't worth your time. So over time, women might just pull back. There's something called echoing, where people can try and repeat someone else's ideas. So if a woman says something and they're ignored, their male colleague can perhaps repeat it but say where the idea came from, so they aren't receiving credit for someone else's idea. And then allow more time in the interview process for people to get to know one another is another one of the practical implications that we thought would be helpful for women. Right, so that was my study in a nutshell. So I want to thank you all for coming today, and let me know.
So how do you translate this into something? You talked about elections.
Mm-hmm.
How can you go around going, you're picking the wrong person because
Right.
you're just picking a bully, and what you really should be doing is looking for someone who's got communal management skills, because that's what leading a country is.
Right.
Or a
I think
city
it's
or a
difficult
school.
in politics in particular.
But you had elections in there, right?
Yeah, we did. We did have, but that was in group elections where basically you choose a leader as a
Right,
group.
and they
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily talking about
Yeah, no, but
running.
I agree.
How do you
Mhm.
take that? Because people get wrapped up in, people like to elect bullies. It's clear from a whole load of studies out there.
Yeah.
Bullies are very attractive and they dominate. How can you communicate that message to people? Because they're not going to like all your tables.
No, you're right. They will not like all the tables. I think what you would have to say are the outcomes associated with, you know, they might see it as being dominant, whereas you're calling it being a bully, right? And so they probably have a different perception of that person's characteristics. And so you'd have to say, well, what are you really interested in this person doing for you? I have an easier time doing that as a manager than a politician, because a politician is not someone I, as a voter, am going to interact with. But my manager, I'm going to interact with them almost on a daily basis. I don't want them to be a jerk to me, and I can imagine what that is like and how that would affect me. Reminding people of the full scale of what you want that person to do as their job would probably be one of the more effective ways to get them to realize what they want. I have someone in my department who frequently says, I don't want to hire a bigger asshole than I am. And so when we're making selection decisions, that is something we keep in mind.
I hear a lot lately about the word team building, and working in teams is considered very important. Is that a good way to translate being communal, being nurturing, less, agentic, to, we want you to be able to work in a team. We want to encourage teamwork, that perhaps that can combat that or help to get that message out there?
Yeah, so definitely communion is important for working in teams. If you look at this in terms of personality traits, another trait that's communal in nature is something called agreeableness, being easygoing, agreeable, that, kind of explains itself. That is one of the leading attributes that predicts how successful a team is. And similarly, I just had a study on narcissism, kind of a very agentic trait, but also a disagreeable group of individuals. So how does having more people like that on a team, that's particularly toxic for teams in general. If you look at leaders of teams, that's also interesting. When you have a team leader who is narcissistic, In general, they are more selfish, and those attributes trickle down to their team members. The team members also become less likely to engage in pro-social activities that are meant to help their coworkers and the organization that they might not get credit for. And when you're a narcissistic team leader as well, there's evidence that you don't perform quite as well because there's not as much information exchange. The narcissistic leader is incredibly self-confident, and because they're so self-confident, other group members aren't as willing to speak up and share their ideas because they think this person knows what they're doing, especially if it's minimal acquaintance. You don't know that person might be incompetent and make bad decisions over time. So that's what, there are lots of reasons you wouldn't want a highly agentic person in a leadership role who's also, and agency doesn't necessarily mean that you are narcissistic, but it is, you couldn't be narcissistic without being highly agentic. So narcissists are high in agency, low in communion. What you want in a leader is a combination of both agency and communion. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Karina Kolicka, and I'm a graduate student in Global Gender Studies, and I'm sorry for being late, but I had my Introduction to Feminist Studies course, and that's why I'm late. But I came because I'm also very interested in gender and leadership. And I want to say that what I just saw the end of the presentations and your findings, but what I really appreciate that because so many leadership studies in terms of findings tell women what they should be doing different, right? And what you're kind of gearing at with your findings is treating leadership as a structural organizational issues, how organizations need to change in order to make more persons able to speak up, because I even see that in my classroom, because the majority of my students are female, how immensely difficult for them is to raise their hand. We all know that probably, right? And especially if you're a non-native speaker, especially if you're a woman, it requires heroism to raise your hand in the classroom, right? It's just so strong. I always sweat when I need to say something, but I do have things to say. So and that you said that it's training other people in terms of their bias and not training women how to be more this or more that. So I think that's the future of gender in leadership studies, that we really have to think how to change organizations in order to take advantage of the expertise and competence that women have. And the second thought, and I don't know, maybe just because I wasn't here when you started your presentation, so maybe you were explaining that, but using the word agentic versus communal, I wasn't sure about that word choice, because for me communal is also very agentic. It's just another way of being agentic, letting other people caring about your relations and looking at how your teammates behave. That's for me very agentic. So I was thinking that maybe I'm not sure if it's a good contrast, because we associate the word agentic with something more positive, especially in terms of leadership. That agentic is something who has the power and the capacity to change things.
I was telling them how the terms used to be masculine and feminine.
Exactly.
So in contrast, I actually think agency and communion are slightly better, because at least they're not directly linking it to sex.
But it still carries some
and I think that's our own societal perceptions. We do link this to gender quite closely.
So maybe individual agentic versus communal agentic, but maybe using the word agentic for both, but just saying that it's more focused on
And I should also say those two are separate. And I just mentioned it's best if leaders can have both. Women and men can both have both of these as well. But I understand your point where agency in this sense is kind of a scientific term, where we're just trying to say this set of characteristics versus this set of characteristics, and those are independent dimensions where like I was saying, you can have both of those at the same time. It's almost society's issue that we so strongly think men are agentic, women are communal.
Plus, being communal for me is agentic. So for me, agentic and communal is just like very similar.
Yeah, but they are, if you look at the data for how these things relate to one another, they are separate characteristics, where some people can be very, like I was saying, for narcissists, these are people who both men and women, if you are narcissistic, you're high in agency, low in communion. And so you kind of, if you mix them, then you might be missing out on some interesting phenomenon. But that doesn't mean that a single person can't have both of these characteristics, and we can understand their behavior as some combination of these two. But I do agree that it's, so I'm having a baby and I'm having a girl, and so I'm already starting to think about how do I not pass on, or how do I teach her that, and she doesn't have to conform to a certain set of beliefs or behave in a certain way that is, perhaps one way I can do that is by saying you can be strong and in a communal way, right? Whatever way you're comfortable in. So, are there any, yeah.
So when you're deciding the agentic and communal traits, so you use different scales to measure them? Or
So they're the same scale, but it has two separate dimensions and the scale.
Okay. And then another question was that you said that the effect size of negative relationship between communal trait and leadership is decreasing, which means that communal traits kind of doesn't decrease the perceived leadership, right? But
but that's decreasing over time. Kind of maybe the tendency for communion to rule someone out as being perceived as the leader. Luckily, fortunately, that seems to be weakening.
But still, is that communal traits are important factors that decides leadership, or it's not really related?
So I would say it is a weak relationship that's still there. It's not as strong as it used to be, but so it's about half of what it was when our parents were around. But I don't think that means if you saw someone who's really, really, and a first acquaintance in a committee, didn't talk very much, most of their contributions were supporting what other people were saying, that kind of thing, those kinds of behaviors might still be perceived as less leader-like, unfortunately, and that still exists. Does that make sense?
Yes. Still, you are saying that communal traits are important factors for leadership, but it doesn't really reflect in real.
Well, unfortunately, we weren't able to look at this. We wanted to look at it by business context and see, do we find the same model in the business world? There just wasn't enough data for us to fill in all those different cells for the business context in particular. If I were to summarize this, I would say agency is much more important than communion, but communion, it's not that it's not important at all. It's just a less important relative to agency.
Is it applied differently too? Because you often hear things when you're looking to promote women in leadership about likability, which is never a factor for men.
Right.
And,
so
and that would appear to they're being judged on a separate scale of communion.
Definitely. So I think in order to be a successful leader, like I was saying, to be effective, it's better if you're high in agency and communion, but in particular, women have to have communion, or else they're, put in the Hillary Clinton box where you're just perceived as being cold and mechanical, and because we dislike that particularly in women, it does not meet our stereotype that women are nurturing and warm. They should be, they tend more so than men to be viewed negatively for that. So they're in this weird double bind where communion can be seen as weak but you have to be likable still as a woman, and you're punished for not adhering to stereotypes.
So Amy Klobuchar would be, she got crossed with some staff and threw behind her on a desk.
I thought that was so interesting.
Seriously?
Yes, and
Let's
how
list what some guys have been doing to their interns and stuff.
I know those poor. Yep. No, I thought Amy Klobuchar was a great example of this phenomenon, where because she has very high expectations. If you don't know, she has very high expectations of her employees. A couple of employees said she yelled at them and she could be abusive. But
she threw a binder on a desk, and when she was upset, she threw something down on the desk, and it bounced and it went near somebody. And imagine saying that about some of the men that I'm sure everybody's interacted with. And
yeah, I think, and as I showed you, particularly for those high-level positions, it makes it much more difficult for women to walk that line where you're at both at the same time in the right amounts. Because you have to be taken seriously, but you can't be too mean, because then that'd be off-putting.
so what we need to do is move the distribution, because if everybody's kind of over here, we need to make it so there's a lot of really, really mean throwing binders at people, not just at the desk, so that this is not an issue. So you have that whole range. This is why I like Elizabeth Holmes, who was the best boss of Theranos. This was a startup that conned millions and millions of dollars out of investors on a bogus claim that they could perform this test better than everybody else. They couldn't. They were just using the competitors' machines, running the sample with poor results. But the thing I like about Elizabeth Holmes, even though she's going to jail, is she's way out here.
Yeah.
And she had all that agency, and she had all
think
that
she's
leadership,
fascinating.
so that it makes it safer for everybody else to fill in a little bit more this way. I'm not suggesting that everybody be mean and crooks, but the more mean crook females there are out there, it opens up the space of where it would be normal for a woman to exist.
More justice.
We don't need to go down the crook line, but it's
Yeah.
amending the distribution.
She definitely doesn't adhere to stereotypes of what you would expect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it's great that you've got these women cons out there.
She's fascinating to me because she's a big narcissist, and most of the time when you see, like you were saying, this kind of example, it's a man who's at these very high levels.
But she just makes it easier for the rest of us who are in Glasgow. We should end the formal session because we are at 1 o'clock. So if anybody needs to leave, I know some people have been. Welcome to stay.